How does an army march past the greatest city the world has ever built and be told that nobody knows who put it there? In the land between two rivers, one kingdom worked out how to hold an empire together. Roads, provinces, an army that never went home. Every empire since has used the same parts. And it was hated so completely that beating it was not enough for its enemies. They set out to wipe the name off the earth. This is the empire of Assyria, and this is how the world learned that an empire can be unmade so thoroughly that even its name is forgotten. 300 years of the Assyrian Empire, and then nothing. The first empire, Akkad, had already come and gone here. It left behind an idea that one man could hold many peoples under one crown. For 1,000 years after Akkad fell, nobody managed it again. The land between the rivers went back to what it had always been, a plain of rival cities, conquered and reconquered, never held. Then in the north, on the upper Tigris, a small kingdom began to grow. It took its name from its god and from the city that God lived in, Ashur. It had no great river delta, no natural riches. What it had was a position on the trade roads and a border it could never stop defending. That is the thing worth understanding about Assyria. Cruel kings were common enough. What Assyria had was an open plain with enemies on every side and 3 centuries of learning that the only safe border is one further away. Every year it pushed the border out. Every year the new border needed defending. From around 911 BC, that pushing became something else. Assyrian kings stopped raiding their neighbors and started keeping them. Ashurnasirpal the Second drove west until his soldiers washed their weapons in the Mediterranean. He built a new capital at Nimrud and opened it with a festival for 69,000 guests. He also left something no earlier conqueror had left. He wrote down exactly what he had done to the cities that resisted him. His inscriptions describe flaying rebel leaders and hanging their skins on the city walls. Impalements outside the gates, not confessions, advertisements. The atrocities were carved into palace walls where foreign envoys would be made to walk past them and copied into inscriptions sent out across the empire. Assyria had worked out that terror, applied publicly and described precisely, is cheaper than a garrison. But terror alone does not build an empire. It only wins battles. The man who turned Assyria from a conqueror into a state took the throne in 745 BC. Tiglath-Pileser the Third did 3 things, and every empire that followed did them too. He broke the conquered lands into provinces and put an appointed governor over each one, answerable to him. He replaced the seasonal army of farmers with a permanent professional one, paid year-round. And he built roads with relay stations so that a message could cross the empire in days rather than weeks. And he did a 4th thing, which is the one history remembers. He began moving entire peoples. A rebellious population was uprooted, marched hundreds of miles, and put down again somewhere it had no land, no allies, and no memory. Their place was filled with deportees from somewhere else, equally lost. Over 3 centuries, the Assyrians moved an estimated 4.5 million people. That is one of the largest forced migrations in history, and it worked the way it was meant to. A people with no homeland does not revolt. It also dissolved dozens of nations into the Assyrian mass permanently. Whole peoples in the Bible simply stopped being mentioned. In 722 BC, a usurper took the throne and chose a name to justify himself. He called himself Sargon. The first Sargon had been dead for more than 1,600 years, the founder of that first empire in the same 2 rivers. Assyria's new king was reaching back across 16 centuries to borrow the authority of a man his own subjects half believed was a legend. Under Sargon and his heirs, the empire reached its full size. Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus paying tribute, and finally Egypt, 3,000 years old and the oldest kingdom on earth, taken by an Assyrian army. Sargon's son Sennacherib crushed a revolt in Judah and destroyed the fortress city of Lachish. He had the entire siege carved, panel by panel, across a room in his palace. It is the most detailed picture of ancient warfare that survives anywhere. He moved the capital to Nineveh and rebuilt it into the largest city in the world. Fed by an aqueduct, that carried water 50 kilometers across the plain. By now, the Assyrian Empire ruled almost everything the world it knew contained. And it had one more king worth naming. Ashurbanipal could read and write, which no Assyrian king before him could. He sent men across the empire to collect tablets and assembled a library at Nineveh of more than 30,000 of them. Medicine, astronomy, law, omens, almost everything the modern world knows about ancient Mesopotamia comes out of that one room. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest story humanity has kept, survives because Ashurbanipal wanted a copy. He was also the man who ended Elam. Elam is the civilization most people have never heard of, and it is older than Assyria, older than Babylon, older very nearly than writing. Its capital, Susa, sat on the plain east of the rivers and had been a city for 4,000 years already. Elam had fought Mesopotamia for most of that time and had usually won. In 647 BC, Ashurbanipal took Susa and recorded what he did there with the usual precision. He leveled the temples. He carried the gods away, which in the ancient world meant the city no longer had anyone to protect it. And he opened the tombs of Elam's kings and scattered their bones, so that the dead could not rest and the living had nothing left to pray to. He wrote that he turned the land to a wilderness where no cattle would low. A civilization 4,000 years old stops appearing in the record at that point. Susa itself survived, and it is worth remembering the name because in 100 years it will be one of the capitals of the empire that finishes Babylon. Assyria had never been larger. Within 35 years, it did not exist. Everything that held it together had to be paid for. A standing army wants wages every month. The wages came out of tribute, and tribute meant campaigning every year. Every province held down by fear needed troops standing on it. And after Ashurbanipal died, the royal family fell into civil war over the throne, which is the one thing it could not survive. In the south, Babylon revolted under a governor named Nabopolassar, and this time it was not put down. In the east, the Medes came out of the Zagros mountains. Two enemies who had every reason to hate Assyria and no reason to fight each other made an alliance. In 614 BC, they took Ashur, the holy city the empire was named for. 2 years later, they came for Nineveh. The largest city in the world held out for 3 months and then fell, and the coalition burned it. The library burned with it, which is the reason it survives. The fire baked the clay tablets hard and buried them under the rubble for 2,500 years. The last Assyrian king fled west to Haran with what remained of the army. Egypt, of all powers, marched to help him, having decided that a weakened Assyria was better than a strong Babylon. It was not enough. By 609 BC, there was no Assyrian state left anywhere. And then something happened that had never happened to an empire before. 200 years later, a Greek mercenary named Xenophon marched an army up the Tigris and past 2 abandoned cities of extraordinary size. He wrote about them because they were the most impressive ruins he had ever seen. He asked who had built them. The locals told him the Medes. He wrote it down and moved on. He was standing in front of Nimrud and Nineveh, the capitals of the empire that had ruled that ground for 300 years, and nobody within walking distance could tell him whose they were. For most of recorded history after that, Assyria existed only as a name in the Bible, and a good many scholars doubted it had ever existed at all. It took until the 1840s and a spade in a mound outside Mosul to prove otherwise. Assyria is the first empire that we can watch inventing the tools of empire: the province, the governor, the standing army, the road built for the messenger rather than the merchant, the deliberate movement of populations to break a people's connection to their own land. Every one of those outlived it. Persia used them, Rome used them, they are still being used. What did not outlive it was Assyria itself. It ruled the known world, wrote everything down, and was erased so completely that the people living on top of its capital forgot its name. The empire that taught the world how to rule was the same one the world decided to forget. The men who burned Nineveh went home down the Euphrates to Babylon. If this is your kind of history, subscribe and tell us in the comments which empire should get the map next.